Chapter 3 The Second of the Three Spirits. Scrooge woke up in the middle of a loud snore and sat up in bed to gather his thoughts. He looked around and knew it was almost 1 o'clock because of the bell ringing. He felt like he had woken up just in time for a meeting with a messenger sent by Jacob Marley. However, he started to feel uncomfortable when he thought about which curtain the messenger would appear from. So, he moved all the curtains and lay down again. He wanted to be ready to challenge the spirit when it appeared and not be surprised and scared. Some people who consider themselves carefree and casual, and who think they are skilled in a few things and aware of what is happening, demonstrate their willingness to have different experiences by saying that they are willing to try anything from a simple gambling game to committing murder. Of course, there are many different activities between these two extremes that they could also participate in. Although I do not want to suggest that Scrooge was as daring as these people, I can tell you that he was open to encountering new and unusual things, and that very little, from a small child to a large animal like a rhinoceros, would surprise him. He was ready for almost anything, but he wasn't completely unprepared. When the clock struck 1 and nothing happened, he began to shake violently. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed, but still nothing happened. He lay in bed the whole time, surrounded by a bright red light that was more frightening than any ghost. He couldn't understand what the light was or what it meant, and he was worried he might be spontaneously combusting without even realizing it. Eventually, he started to think that the light might be coming from the room next door, so he quietly got out of bed and went to the door in his slippers. As soon as Scrooge put his hand on the lock, a weird voice called out his name and told him to come inside. He did what he was told. He entered his own room and it was unmistakable. However, it had changed in a surprising way. The walls and ceiling were covered with living greenery, creating a perfect grove. Bright berries shone from all corners. The shiny leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected the light like tiny mirrors scattered throughout. A roaring fire blazed in the hearth, unlike anything Scrooge or Marley had seen in years. A pile of food, including turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, joints of meat, sucking pigs, sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, hot chestnuts, apples, oranges, pears, large cakes, and bowls of punch, were stacked on the floor to form a makeshift throne. A jolly giant sat on the throne, holding a torch that resembled the horn of plenty, shining it high to illuminate Scrooge as he peeked through the door. "Come in," said the ghost excitedly. "Come in and get to know me better, man." Scrooge went inside quietly and looked down in front of the spirit. He wasn't as stubborn as he used to be. Although the spirit had clear and friendly eyes, Scrooge didn't feel comfortable looking into them. "I am the Christmas present ghost," said the spirit. "Look at me." Scrooge looked at it with respect and did as he was told. The ghost was wearing a plain, dark green robe with a white fur trim. The robe hung so loosely on the ghost that its broad chest was uncovered, as if it didn't want to be hidden by any clothes. The ghost's feet, which could be seen beneath the folds of the robe, were also bare. It wore a holly wreath on its head, with shiny icicles here and there. Its long, curly brown hair was loose and free, just like its friendly face, bright eyes, open hand, cheerful voice, relaxed manner, and joyful demeanor. The ghost had an old-fashioned scabbard around its waist, but there was no sword in it, and the sheath itself was rusted. The spirit said, "You have never seen anyone like me before." "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "Have I ever gone for a walk with my younger family members, which means my older brothers who were born in recent years, considering I am very young?" asked the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm scared I haven't." "Did you have many brothers, spirit?" The ghost said, "More than 1,800. Scrooge mumbled, "I have a huge family to take care of." The ghost of Christmas present rose. "I'm ready to follow you, spirit," Scrooge said humbly. "Last night I had to go with you, but I learned something important. If you have something to teach me tonight, please let me learn from it. Touch my robe." Scrooge did what he was instructed to do, and he held onto it tightly. Gone in an instant were the holiday items such as holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch. The room, fire, ruddy glow, and late hour of the night also vanished. Suddenly, they found themselves on the city streets on Christmas morning. The weather was harsh, and people were outside scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their homes and from their rooftops. This action created a rough, but lively and enjoyable kind of music. The boys were particularly delighted to see the snow fall from the roofs in small, artificial snowstorms. The fronts of the houses looked very dark and the windows even darker, compared to the white snow on the roofs and the dirtier snow on the ground. The snow on the ground had been plowed up by carts and wagons, making deep furrows that crossed each other many times, creating complex channels that were hard to follow in the thick, yellow mud and icy water. The sky was dark and the smaller streets were full of a dirty mist that was partially thawed and partially frozen. The heavier particles of the mist fell like a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain were on fire. Despite the gloomy weather and the state of the town, there was an atmosphere of cheerfulness that even the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun could not match. The people on the roofs were happy and having fun. They were shoveling snow and throwing snowballs at each other. The shops that sold meat and fruit were still open. There were baskets of chestnuts, onions, pears, apples, grapes, and filberts. The fruit looked very delicious and was arranged nicely in the shop windows. There were also fish in a bowl that seemed to be aware that something exciting was happening around them. The grocery store was almost closed with maybe 1 or 2 shutters down, but oh, what glimpses you could catch through those gaps! It wasn't just the cheerful sound of the scales on the counter, or the quick separation of twine and roller, or even the rattling of canisters like juggling tricks. It wasn't just the pleasant scent of tea and coffee, or the abundance of raisins, the incredibly white almonds, the long and straight cinnamon sticks, the delicious other spices, or the candied fruits that were so covered in molten sugar that they made even the coldest onlookers feel faint and then sick. It wasn't just the moist and pulpy figs, or the French plums that blushed with modest tartness from their fancy boxes, or that everything was good to eat and dressed up for Christmas. It was the customers who were in such a hurry and so eager for the promise of the day that they bumped into each other at the door, wildly crashing their wicker baskets, leaving their purchases on the counter, and then running back to get them, making hundreds of mistakes, but always in good humor. The grocer and his staff were so friendly and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind could have been their own, worn outside for everyone to see and for Christmas birds to peck at if they so chose. Soon the church bells rang and called the good people to the church and chapel. They came through the streets in their best clothes and with their happiest faces. At the same time, many people came out of small streets and lanes carrying their meals to the bakeries. The Spirit was very interested in the sight of these poor people celebrating, and he stood with Scrooge in front of a bakery. As the meal carriers passed by, the Spirit took off the covers and sprinkled incense on their meals from his torch. The torch was very unusual because when some meal carriers argued with each other, he sprinkled a few drops of water from it and their good mood was restored immediately. They said it was wrong to argue on Christmas Day, and it was. God bless it, it was. Eventually, the bells stopped ringing and the bakers closed their shops. However, you could still see the memory of all those delicious meals being prepared, as a wet patch on the ground above each oven, where the steam rose up as if the stones themselves were cooking. Scrooge asked, "Does the thing you sprinkle from your torch have a unique taste?" "There is." "My own. Does it apply to any type of dinner today?" Scrooge asked. "Give to anyone who is kind, but especially to someone who is poor." Scrooge asked, "Why does the poor one receive the most?" "Because it needs it most." After thinking for a moment, Scrooge said, "Spirit, I am surprised that you, out of all the creatures in the many worlds around us, would want to limit these people's chances to have innocent fun." "I," cried the Spirit. Scrooge said, "You want to take away their way of having a meal every seventh day, which is usually the only day they can really have a meal. Don't you think that's wrong?" "I," cried the Spirit. Scrooge said, "You want to close these places on the seventh day, and that means the same thing." "I seek," exclaimed the Spirit. The Spirit said, "Some people on this earth think they know us and do things like passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name. However, they are not related to us and are just as unfamiliar to us as if they had never existed. Keep this in mind and blame their actions on themselves, not us." Scrooge said he would keep his promise, and they went together, still invisible, to the outskirts of the town. The ghost had a special ability that Scrooge noticed before at the baker's shop. Even though he was huge, he could fit into small spaces easily. He stood under a low roof just as gracefully as if he were in a grand hall, looking like a supernatural being. Maybe the good spirit enjoyed demonstrating his power, or maybe it was his kind and generous personality, and his compassion for all poor people, that made him go straight to Scrooge's clerks. He took Scrooge with him, holding onto his robe, and they went to the clerk's home. At the doorstep, the Spirit smiled and blessed Bob Cratchit's four-room house with the sprinkling of his torch. Can you imagine that? Bob only earned 15 bob a week and kept only 15 copies of his name on Saturdays, yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his humble home. Mrs. Cratchit, who is Bob Cratchit's wife, got up from her seat. She wore a dress that had been turned twice and was poor in quality, but she had put on ribbons which were inexpensive yet made her look good. She started setting the table with the help of her daughter Belinda, who also wore ribbons. Meanwhile, Master Peter Cratchit, one of their sons, stuck a fork into the pot of potatoes. He tucked his shirt collar, which was huge and belonged to Bob, his father, into his mouth. He was happy to be dressed so nicely and wanted to show off his clothes in the fashionable parks. Two younger Cratchit children, a boy and a girl, burst into the room and shouted that they had smelled the goose outside the baker's shop and knew it was theirs. They danced around the table, dreaming of the delicious sage and onion stuffing, and praised Master Peter Cratchit. He blew on the fire, not being proud, although his collars almost choked him. Finally, the potatoes started to bubble up and made a loud noise, so he peeled them and let them out of the saucepan. "What happened to your dear father?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't even half an hour late last Christmas Day." A girl appeared and said, "Here's Martha, Mother." "Look, Mom." "Here's Martha," exclaimed the two young Cratchits. "Yay! There's a big goose, Martha." My dear, you're so late," said Mrs. Cratchit, giving her lots of kisses and helping her take off her shawl and hat eagerly. "The girl said that we had a lot of work to finish last night and we had to tidy up this morning, Mother." "Oh well. Don't worry as long as you have come," Mrs. Cratchit said. "Sit down in front of the fire, my dear, and warm yourself up. May the Lord bless you." "No, no. Father is coming," shouted the two young Cratchits, who were moving quickly in all directions. "Hide, Martha, hide." Martha hid herself. Then Bob, the father, came in with a big blanket hanging in front of him. The blanket was at least 3 feet long, not counting the fringe. Bob's clothes were old and worn, but he had mended them and brushed them to look nice for the season. He also carried Tiny Tim on his shoulder. Unfortunately, Tiny Tim had to use a little crutch to walk, and his limbs were supported by an iron frame. "Where is Martha?" asked Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "I'm not coming," Bob said suddenly, feeling down after being Tim's ride home from church and feeling energized. "You mean, you're not coming on Christmas Day?" Martha didn't want to see him sad, even if it was just a joke. She came out early from behind the closet door and ran into his arms. Meanwhile, the two young Cratchits quickly took Tiny Tim and brought him to the wash house, so he could hear the pudding singing in the pot. "And how did the little Tim behave?" Mrs. Cratchit asked after she encouraged Bob and he hugged his daughter happily. Bob said, "He is really good and even better than that. Sometimes, he sits alone and thinks about strange things. On the way back home, he told me that he hoped people noticed him in the church, because he is disabled. He thought it might make them happy to remember on Christmas Day that someone could make beggars walk and blind men see." Bob sounded shaky when he told them this, and his voice shook even more when he mentioned that Tiny Tim was getting healthier and stronger. Tiny Tim's crutch could be heard as he walked on the floor. He came back quickly, escorted by his brother and sister, and sat down on his stool by the fire. Bob rolled up his sleeves to make a hot drink with gin and lemons, and put it on the stove to heat. Meanwhile, Master Peter and the two young Cratchits went to get the goose, which they brought back in a grand procession. Everyone was so busy that you might have thought a goose was the rarest bird of all, even more rare than a black swan. In fact, in that house, it was a very special occasion. Mrs. Cratchit had made the gravy earlier, and it was now hot and hissing in a little saucepan. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with great strength. Miss Belinda sweetened the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob sat with Tiny Tim in a small corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everyone, including themselves, and waited for their turn to be served. They even stuffed spoons in their mouths so they wouldn't scream for the goose before it was their turn. Finally, the dishes were put on the table and they said grace. There was a moment of anticipation as Mrs. Cratchit slowly looked down the carving knife and prepared to cut into the breast. But when she did, and the stuffing poured out, everyone at the table let out a murmur of delight. Even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, banged on the table with the handle of his knife and weakly shouted, "Hurrah!" Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a delicious goose cooked. Everyone loved its tenderness, flavor, size, and the fact that it was cheap. They served it with apple sauce and mashed potatoes, which was enough food for the whole family. Mrs. Cratchit was very happy with the dinner, and even though they didn't eat it all, everyone had enough. The youngest Cratchits had eaten so much that they were full of sage and onion. Miss Belinda changed the plates and then Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone to bring in the pudding, because she was too nervous to have anyone watch her. Imagine if it wasn't done properly. Imagine if it broke when we tried to use it. What if someone climbed over the wall into our backyard and stole it while we were enjoying our meal? The two young Cratchits turned pale at the thought of this happening. They imagined all sorts of terrible things. Hello! There was a lot of steam. The pudding was taken out of the pot. It smelled like laundry day because of the cloth, and also like a restaurant and a bakery next to each other, with a washerwoman's place next to them. That smell was coming from the pudding. After half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit came in, looking a little red, but also proud, carrying the pudding. It looked like a spotted cannonball, so hard and firm, with flames from ignited brandy, and decorated with Christmas holly on top. "Wow, what a great pudding," said Bob Cratchit. He calmly stated that it was the best thing his wife had made since they got married. Mrs. Cratchit admitted that she had some doubts about the amount of flour she used, but now that it turned out so well, she felt relieved. Everyone had an opinion about the pudding, but no one dared to say that it was too small for their large family. That would have been considered a serious offense. Even the Cratchits would have been embarrassed to suggest such a thing. Finally, the dinner was finished, the tablecloth was removed, the fireplace was cleaned, and the fire was replenished. After checking and approving the drink in the jug, some apples and oranges were placed on the table and a shovel full of chestnuts were added to the fire. Then, the entire Cratchit family gathered around the fireplace, forming a semicircle according to Bob Cratchit. On Bob Cratchit's side, there were 2 glasses and a small cup without a handle. Bob used some containers to hold the hot drink from the jug, which were just as good as golden goblets would have been. Bob was very happy as he served the drink, while the chestnuts on the fire made loud noises. After that, Bob suggested, "Happy Christmas to everyone, my dear friends. May God bless us." Which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us everyone," said Tiny Tim, who was the last one to speak. He sat beside his father and very close to him on a small stool. Bob held his father's small and wrinkled hand tightly as if he loved him so much and wanted to keep him close, and was afraid that his father might leave him. Scrooge said, "Spirit," with a curiosity he had never felt before, "please tell me if Tiny Tim will survive." "I see an empty chair," said the ghost, "in the poor corner by the fireplace, and a walking stick that no one is using, kept carefully. If things don't change in the future, the child will die." Scrooge said, "No, no." He added, "Oh, no, gentle spirit. Please tell me that he will not be punished." "If things don't change in the future," said the ghost, "none of my people will find him here. What should we do then? If he's going to die anyway, it's better for him to die and reduce the number of people." Scrooge felt ashamed and sad when he heard the spirit repeat his own words, and he lowered his head. The ghost said, "If you have a kind heart and are not stubborn, don't say wicked things until you find out what the surplus is and where it is. Do you want to choose who lives and who dies? Maybe in heaven's eyes, you are more useless and unworthy of living than millions of people, including this poor man's child. Oh God! It's like hearing a bug on a leaf deciding that there's too much life among his starving brothers in the dirt." Scrooge lowered his body in response to the ghost's criticism, and shook with fear while looking down at the ground. However, he quickly lifted his eyes when he heard his own name. "Mr. Scrooge!" Bob exclaimed. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the one who started the feast." "The one who started the feast, really?" exclaimed Mrs. Cratchit, getting red in the face. "I wish he was here. I would tell him exactly what I think and hope he would enjoy listening to it." Bob said, "My dear, it's Christmas Day. We need to think about the children." "I think it must be Christmas Day," she said. "On this day, we drink to the health of Mr. Scrooge, who is such a mean, stingy, cold-hearted man. You know it very well, Robert. You poor thing, nobody knows it better than you." Bob gave a gentle response saying, "My dear, it's Christmas Day." Mrs. Cratchit said, "I'll drink to his health because of you and the holiday season, not because of him. Cheers to a long life for him. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'm sure he'll be very jolly and pleased." The kids drank the toast after her. It wasn't as cheerful as their previous actions. Tiny Tim drank it last, but he didn't really like it. Scrooge was the mean person in the family. When they talked about him, it made the party sad, and it took 5 minutes to feel better. After Scrooge the Baleful had died, they became 10 times happier than before simply because they were relieved that he was gone. Bob Cratchit told them that he had found a job opportunity for Master Peter, which would pay him 5 and 6pence per week if he got it. The 2 young Cratchits found it hilarious that Peter could be a businessman, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully into the fire, considering what he would do with his new income. Martha, who was an apprentice at a milliner's, described the kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked in a row. She also mentioned that she planned to sleep in tomorrow since it was a holiday she had off. Martha went on to tell them about how she had seen a countess and a lord a few days before, and how the lord was nearly as tall as Peter, causing Peter to pull up his collar so high that you couldn't see his head if you were there. Meanwhile, they shared chestnuts and drinks while singing a song that Tiny Tim, who had a sad little voice, sang well. The song was about a lost child traveling in the snow. This family wasn't extraordinary in any way. They didn't look good, they weren't wearing nice clothes, their shoes weren't waterproof, and they didn't have many clothes. Peter probably had to sell something valuable to a pawnbroker. Despite this, they were happy, thankful, enjoyed each other's company, and were happy with their current situation. When they disappeared, they looked even happier in the shining light of the Spirit's torch, and Scrooge was watching them, especially Tiny Tim, until the very end. It was becoming dark and snowing heavily. Scrooge and the Spirit were walking on the streets. The fires in kitchens, parlors, and all kinds of rooms were very bright. The flickering of the blaze showed that people were preparing for a cozy dinner. The hot plates were baking through and through before the fire. There were also deep red curtains, ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. Children were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. The window blinds had shadows of guests assembling. There was a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once. They tripped lightly off to some near neighbor's house, where a single man who saw them enter would be in trouble. They were artful witches, and they knew it. If you looked at the number of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might think that nobody was at home to welcome them. But in reality, every house was expecting company and had lit their fires high. The ghost was very happy and spread its bright and harmless cheer everywhere it went. Even the lamplighter, who was running ahead to light the street lamps and was dressed to go somewhere for the evening, laughed out loud as the Spirit passed by. However, the lamplighter did not know that he had any company other than Christmas. Without warning, the ghost led them to a bleak and empty moor. The ground was covered with huge, rough stones, as if it was the graveyard of giants. Water was everywhere, but it was frozen solid by the cold. Nothing could grow there except for moss, furze, and coarse grass. In the west, the sun had set, leaving a fiery red streak, which glared upon the desolate landscape for a moment like an angry eye. Then, it disappeared into the darkness of the night sky. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. The Spirit said that there is a place where miners live and work deep underground. They are familiar with the Spirit. "Look!" They saw a light coming from the window of a small house, and they quickly moved towards it. When they went through the wall made of mud and stones, they found a happy group gathered around a warm fire. There was an old man and an old woman, their children and their grandchildren, and even more generations beyond that. They were all dressed up in festive clothes. The old man was singing a Christmas song in a voice that was rarely heard over the sound of the wind outside. It was a very old song that he had learned when he was a young boy, and everyone joined in with the chorus from time to time. Whenever they sang loudly, the old man became cheerful and sang louder too, but when they stopped singing, his energy faded away. The ghost didn't stay there, but asked Scrooge to hold onto his robe. They went over the moor and headed to the sea. Scrooge was terrified when he looked back and saw the scary rocks behind them. He heard the loud sound of water as it moved and crashed through the dangerous caves it had made, trying to destroy the earth. There was a lonely lighthouse standing on a reef of sunken rocks a few miles away from the shore. The water around it was rough and choppy all year round. The base of the lighthouse was covered in piles of seaweed and storm birds, which seemed to be born from the wind just as seaweed is from the water, flew around it, riding the waves. However, even in this place, two men were watching the light and had built a fire. The fire shone through a small opening in the thick stone wall and cast a bright light on the scary sea. The men put their rough hands together over the wooden table they were sitting at and wished each other a happy Christmas while drinking grog. The elder man, whose face was damaged and scarred from years of rough weather like the figurehead of an old ship, started singing a strong and powerful song that sounded like a gust of wind. Once again, the ghost moved quickly over the dark and turbulent sea, until they reached a ship that was far from any shore. The ghost told Scrooge that they had arrived at their destination, and they stood next to the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout at the front of the ship, and the officers who were on watch. These were all dark and eerie figures in their different positions. However, each one of them was humming a Christmas song or had a Christmas thought in their mind. They spoke quietly to their companion about a past Christmas day, and they had hopes of returning home. On that day, every man on board, whether they were awake or asleep, good or bad, spoke kinder words to one another than on any other day of the year. They shared in the festivities to some extent, and they remembered those who were far away, knowing that they also delighted in remembering them. Scrooge was surprised while he listened to the wind and thought about how scary it was to move through the dark over an unknown abyss, which was as mysterious as death. Suddenly, he heard a loud laugh. Scrooge was very surprised to realize that it was his nephew's laugh. He was even more surprised when he found himself in a bright, dry, and shiny room with the spirit next to him. The spirit was smiling and looking at Scrooge's nephew in a friendly way. Scrooge's nephew laughed and said, "Ha, ha." Then he laughed again and said, "Ha, ha, ha." If you happen to know a man who laughs more than Scrooge's nephew, which is unlikely, I would like to meet him as well. Please introduce him to me and I will try to become his friend. It's fair and good that while sickness and sadness can spread, nothing is as infectious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed so hard that he held his sides, rolled his head, and twisted his face, his wife's niece laughed just as heartily. And their friends who were there didn't hesitate to join in and laugh loudly too. Ha, ha. Ha, ha, ha. Ha! Scrooge's nephew exclaimed. He said Christmas was nonsense, can you believe it? And he actually believed it. Fred, he should be even more ashamed, said Scrooge's niece angrily. Those women are wonderful. They never do anything halfway. They are always serious. She was really beautiful, very beautiful. She had a cute face with dimples and a surprised expression, a small mouth that looked like it was meant to be kissed, and some little dots on her chin that blended together when she laughed. Her eyes were very bright and cheerful. She was a bit annoying in a teasing way, but also very pleasing. Overall, she was absolutely satisfying. Scrooge's nephew said, "He's an amusing old man, but not very nice. However, he will suffer the consequences of his actions, and I don't have anything bad to say about him." Scrooge's niece hinted to Fred, "I think he's very rich." "You always say that, don't you?" "What does it matter, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His money is not helpful to him. He doesn't use it for good. He doesn't even make himself comfortable with it. He doesn't have the satisfaction of thinking, ha, ha, ha. that he will ever use it to benefit us." Scrooge's niece said, "I can't stand him." Her sisters and other women agreed with her. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I feel sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him even if I wanted to. He always suffers from his bad moods. This time he decided to not like us, and he won't come to have dinner with us. What happens as a result? He misses out on a good meal." "I think he's missing out on a great dinner," Scrooge's niece interrupted. Everyone agreed, and they were probably good judges since they had just finished eating and were gathered around the fire, with dessert on the table and the room lit by lamps. "I'm really happy to hear that," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I don't really trust young people who are in charge of households. What do you think, Topper?" Topper seemed interested in one of Scrooge's niece's sisters. He said that a single man was a sad person who shouldn't give his opinion on something. This made the plump sister with the lace collar, not the one with roses, blush. "Please continue, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, while clapping her hands. "He always starts talking but never finishes his sentences. He is such a silly person." Scrooge's nephew enjoyed another laugh, and everyone else joined in, even though his plump sister tried to prevent it with aromatic vinegar. Scrooge's nephew said, "I just wanted to say that if Scrooge doesn't want to have fun with us, it's his loss. He's missing out on some enjoyable moments that wouldn't harm him. I'm certain he's missing out on better company than what he can find in his old, boring office or dusty chambers. I plan on inviting him every year, whether he likes it or not, because I feel sorry for him. He may complain about Christmas all he wants, but he can't help but think positively about it when he sees me in a good mood and saying, 'How are you, Uncle Scrooge?' every year. If it only encourages him to give his poor clerk £50, that's something. I think I even made him think about it yesterday." Now it was their time to laugh at the idea of Scrooge being shaken. However, since he was very friendly and didn't mind what they were laughing at, as long as they were laughing, he joined in their fun and happily passed around the bottle. After having tea, they enjoyed some music. They were a musical family and knew how to sing songs like a glee or catch very well. Topper was especially good at singing in a deep voice without straining his forehead or turning red. Scrooge's niece played the harp beautifully and even played a simple tune that was familiar to Scrooge from his childhood. The Ghost of Christmas Past reminded him of this tune, and it brought back memories of all the things the ghost had shown him. As he listened to the music, he became softer and realized that if he had listened to this kind of music earlier in his life, he might have been happier without having to rely on burying Jacob Marley with the sexton spade. But they didn't spend the whole evening listening to music. After a while, they played a game of forfeits. It's fun to act like children sometimes, especially at Christmas when the person who started it all was a child himself. Suddenly, they stopped the game to play blind man's buff. Of course, they did. I don't believe Topper was really blind. I think he and Scrooge's nephew had planned it beforehand. And I also think that the Ghost of Christmas Present knew about it. Topper chased after Scrooge's plump sister in the lace tucker, and it was ridiculous how he knocked over things, fell on chairs, hit the piano, and got tangled up in the curtains. But he always knew where she was and wouldn't catch anyone else. If you intentionally bumped into him, he would pretend to try to catch you, which was insulting to your intelligence, but then he would quickly move towards the plump sister. She would often complain that it wasn't fair, and she was right. However, when he finally caught her and cornered her so she couldn't escape, his behavior was terrible. He pretended not to recognize her and said that he needed to touch her hair accessory and check a certain ring on her finger and a particular chain around her neck to verify her identity. It was awful and monstrous. No doubt she shared her thoughts about it when they spoke privately behind the curtains with another person as the blind man. Scrooge's niece did not participate in the game of blindman's buff, but she had a comfortable seat in a cozy corner where the ghost and Scrooge were sitting closely behind her. However, she joined in the forfeits and expressed her admiration for her love using all the letters of the alphabet. She was also very good at the game of how, when, and where, and to the delight of Scrooge's nephew, she outplayed her sisters, who were also clever girls. Although there were about 20 people of different ages present, they all played, including Scrooge, who forgot that he couldn't be heard and sometimes shouted his guesses out loud. He often guessed correctly because he was as sharp as the best Whitechapel needle, which is guaranteed not to cut the eye, despite thinking he was dull. The ghost was very happy to see him feeling this way, and liked him very much. The ghost asked like a child if he could stay until the guests left. However, the spirit said that it couldn't happen. Scrooge said, "I have a new game." "We'll play for only half an hour, spirit." "Just one." Scrooge's nephew played a game called Yes and No. He thought of an animal and the other players asked him questions to guess what animal he was thinking of. He could only answer yes or no to their questions. He described the animal as live, savage, growling, grunting, and talking. It lived in London, walked around the streets, and was not kept in a menagerie or led by anyone. He also said it was not a horse, ass, cow, bull, tiger, dog, pig, cat, or bear. The nephew laughed a lot and even had to stand up and stamp his feet because he was so tickled. Finally, the plump sister also laughed and cried out, "I figured it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge." It was definitely impressive. Everyone admired it, although some people said that the answer to "Is it a bear?" should have been yes. They thought that saying no was enough to make people stop thinking about Mr. Scrooge, assuming they were ever thinking about him in the first place. Fred said, "He has made us laugh a lot, I'm sure, so it would be rude not to raise a glass and wish him good health. We have a glass of warm spiced wine right here, so let's say, cheers to Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried. Scrooge's nephew said, "I wish the old man, whoever he is, a Happy New Year and a Merry Christmas. He didn't accept my greeting, but I hope he has a good time." "Hello, Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had become so happy and carefree without anyone noticing, that he would have thanked the people around him without them realizing it, if the ghost had given him a chance. But the entire scene ended as soon as his nephew finished speaking, and he and the ghost continued on their journey. They saw a lot and went far, visiting many homes, but always with a happy ending. The spirit was present next to sick people, who felt happy, as well as in foreign lands, where they felt at home. The spirit was patient and hopeful around struggling people, making them feel better, and around poverty, it made them feel rich. The spirit went to many places like almshouses, hospitals, and jails, where people were in misery. In every refuge of misery, where man in his limited authority had not locked the door and barred the spirit out, it left its blessing and taught Scrooge its principles. The night felt very long to Scrooge, and he wasn't even sure if it was just one night. He thought the Christmas holidays felt like they happened in the same amount of time they spent together. Scrooge found it strange that although he looked the same, the ghost appeared to be getting older, visibly older. Scrooge had noticed this change, but had never mentioned it until they left a party for children celebrating Twelfth Night. They stood in an open area, and when Scrooge looked at the spirit, he noticed that its hair was now grey. Scrooge asked, "Do spirits have such short lives?" "I don't live for long on this earth," said the ghost. "It will end tonight." "Tonight!" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight." "Listen! The time is getting closer." The bells were ringing at 11:45 at that time. The spirit said it sadly might be a claw, because there is flesh on it. "Look at it here." The robe of the creature had 2 children hidden in its folds. The children looked very sad, ugly, and miserable. They kneeled in front of the creature and held onto its clothes tightly. "Oh, man! Look here! Look, look, down here," said the ghost excitedly. There were a boy and a girl. They looked yellow, thin, ragged, and angry, almost like wolves. They were lying on the ground, showing their humble position. Instead of having the beauty and freshness of youth on their faces, their features looked wrinkled and twisted, as if they had been touched by an old and withered hand. Their faces looked like a place where devils could sit instead of angels, and they gave off a frightening vibe. There is nothing worse than these monsters, created by any change or degradation or perversion of humanity, throughout all the mysteries of wonderful creation. Scrooge was shocked and taken aback. When he saw the children in that manner, he wanted to say they were good children, but he couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come out because he didn't want to lie about something so big. Scrooge couldn't say anything else when he asked, "Are they your spirits?" "They belong to humanity," said the ghost, looking at them. "And they rely on me, seeking help from their ancestors. This boy represents ignorance and this girl represents poverty. Be careful of both of them, and all who are like them, but especially watch out for this boy. I can see that he carries a bad fate on his forehead, unless it's removed." "Don't believe it," exclaimed the ghost, pointing its hand towards the city. "Accuse those who spread such rumors. Accept it only for your own selfish reasons, and make it worse. And wait for the final consequences." Scrooge cried out, "Do they have no place to go or anything to rely on?" The spirit looked at him and repeated his own words, "Are there no prisons?" and asked, Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge searched for the ghost, but couldn't find it. When the bell stopped ringing, he remembered what old Jacob Marley had predicted. He looked up and saw a serious phantom, covered in a cloak and hood, approaching him like a mist on the ground.